The Kansas prairie of the 1,870 was supposed to be a land of renewal, a place where weary travelers and homesteaders could start over after the Civil War. But along the Osage Trail, just outside Cherryvale, a quiet family known as the Benders turned that promise of safety into a nightmare. John and Elvira Bender, with their grown children Kate and John Jr., settled on a 160-acre plot in Labette County. To passing settlers, they appeared ordinary German immigrants who spoke little English, ran a small inn, and sold supplies to travelers. Kate, the daughter, presented herself as a healer and spiritualist, advertising seances and magnetic healing. Newspapers called her charming, educated, and dangerous. But guests who stayed at the Bender home had a habit of disappearing. Travelers heading west would stop for dinner and never reach their destination. It began quietly. A missing prospector, a vanished preacher, a man, and his young daughter, last seen heading toward the Benders' property. The trail always went cold at the same place. In the spring of 1873, suspicion finally broke open. A well-known local doctor, Dr. William York, had gone missing while searching for the same travelers who'd vanished before him. His horse was found wandering, but there was no sign of him. York's brothers, one a state senator, the other a colonel, organized a search. When they reached the Bender Inn, the family welcomed them politely. The room smelled faintly of iron and decay. Soon after, the Benders were gone. The house stood eerily silent. Food still on the table, livestock abandoned. Neighbors gathered to investigate, prying up floorboards and digging near the vegetable garden. What they found became frontier legend. 11 bodies, buried in shallow graves, each with a smashed skull and a slit throat. The investigators realized the inn's layout was a trap. Guests were seated with their backs to a curtain, where one of the Benders, usually John Sr. or Jr., would strike them on the head with a hammer. The body would drop through a trapdoor into the cellar, where Elvira and Kate would rob and finish the victims before burying them in the orchard. Among the dead was Dr. York, his skull crushed. Another was a small girl, believed to have been buried alive. Word spread across Kansas in a fury. Newspapers branded the Benders, the Bloody Benders, the Kansas Fiends, and the Devil's Family. Posses formed and scoured the prairie, but the killers had vanished without a trace. Rumors of sightings poured in for years. Texas, Missouri, even the Dakota frontier. Some believed the family had split up. Others claimed vigilantes caught and lynched them in secret. No conclusive proof ever surfaced. By the late 19th century, the Benders had become part of American folklore, the first recorded family of serial killers in U.S. history. Their inn, once a refuge for weary travelers, became a symbol of betrayal hidden under the guise of hospitality. Even now, historians examining Kansas state archives and contemporary newspapers note that the Benders' story blurred fact and legend, but the bodies in the orchard were very real. The Labette County Historical Society maintains a file on the case, confirming the discovery of at least a dozen graves and the disappearance of the family after April 1873. A century later, the legend still haunts Kansas. The message endures. On the frontier, evil didn't always wear a mask sometimes. It smiled from behind the dinner table. By the time the graves were unearthed on the Benders' Kansas property in May 1873, the prairie had become a scene of horror. Word spread fast within days. Hundreds of locals, journalists, and lawmen flooded the orchard, staring in disbelief at the line of shallow pits. Inside them lay the victims, who had once sought nothing more than a warm meal and a roof over their heads. The local paper, the Independence Tribune, described the air around the property as thick with the stench of death and disbelief. At the edge of the small frame house, searchers found a trapdoor beneath a blood-stained carpet, leading to a dark cellar. The smell below was unbearable: congealed stains, scraps of fabric, and fragments of bone. Lantern light revealed how the murders worked. A guest seated at the dining table, back to the curtain. A hammer strike from behind. A body sliding through the trapdoor. And finally, burial in the garden. The victim's possessions, watches, pistols, jewelry, and travelers' trunks were stacked neatly in a shed. A chilling detail noted in the Kansas Historical Society's account described the Benders' victims as mostly men traveling alone, well-dressed, and carrying cash. The Benders had turned hospitality into a business of death. When the search party fanned out across the prairie, they expected to find the family hiding nearby. Instead, the Benders had vanished completely. Horses and wagon tracks trailed north for a few miles before fading. A posse rode for weeks, following rumors across Kansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory, but no trace was confirmed. What followed was a public frenzy bordering on myth. Newspapers from Chicago to New York printed sensational versions of the story, some claiming vigilantes had caught and lynched the Benders, others insisting they fled to Texas or Mexico. One tale even said Kate Bender had joined a traveling circus under a false name. None of these were ever verified. The Kansas governor offered a reward of $2,000 a fortune at the time for information leading to their capture. Several women were arrested in later years, claiming to be Kate or Elvira Bender, but every case ended with inconclusive evidence. The real Benders simply disappeared into history. The site itself became a macabre tourist attraction. According to Kansas historical records, travelers passing through Labette County for decades afterward would stop to visit Hell's Half Acre, the plot where the house once stood. Locals refused to live near it. The wood from the cabin was torn apart by souvenir hunters, piece by piece. For investigators and historians, the Bender story became a grim template proof that evil could hide in plain sight, even in the heart of small-town respectability. The Kansas State Historical Society still preserves documents and letters from the original investigation, including the coroner's report describing the orchard graves. 11 bodies were officially recorded, though locals long whispered that the number was higher. More than a century later, the mystery still refuses to die. No definitive evidence of the Benders' fate has ever surfaced. No trial, no graves, no confession. Just the wind on the Kansas prairie, blowing across a patch of ground where kindness once turned to cruelty. One old newspaper headline captured it best. The Benders welcomed you with supper and sent you to the soil. A reminder that on the American frontier, the line between sanctuary and slaughter was sometimes only as thin as a curtain behind a wooden chair.
Every week, we uncover cases that defies logic. Behind each episode are hours of research, scripting, and editing to make sure every detail you hear is true. What you're watching isn't entertainment. It's real documentary work that remembers the victims and exposes the silence around them. Hit subscribe. It's free for you, but it helps us keep investigating, narrating, and preserving the stories the world would rather erase.
To the neighbors of 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, Fred and Rose West seemed like an unremarkable couple, friendly, a bit rough around the edges, raising a large family in the working-class heart of the West Country. But behind those walls, hidden beneath concrete and floorboards, they built one of the darkest domestic prisons in British history. Fred West was born in 1941 inches rural Herefordshire, the son of a farm labourer. His childhood was marked by rumours of incest and abuse, though never proven. From a young age, he showed a fascination with control and cruelty. After a motorcycle accident at 17 left him with a head injury and a metal plate in his skull, family members said his personality changed. He became volatile, violent, and obsessed with sex. Rose Letts, born in 1953, grew up in a fractured household of her own. By 16, she had left school and fallen in with Fred, then nearly twice her age and already married. When they began living together, social services were quickly alarmed by their treatment of Fred's children. But the warnings went nowhere. By the early 1970s, the pair had turned their modest home into a trap. They began taking in young lodgers and runaways, women who thought they were safe in the West's home, only to vanish without a trace. Beneath the house, Fred had constructed a maze of cellar rooms, which he called his play area. Later excavations would reveal the truth, a network of makeshift torture chambers, their walls soundproofed and buried with the remains of victims. Among the first to disappear was Charmaine West, Fred's daughter from his first marriage. Rose despised her, and when Fred was briefly imprisoned for theft, Charmaine vanished. Rose told neighbors the child had gone to live with her mother. Years later, police would find Charmaine's remains buried under the kitchen floor with evidence showing she had died before Fred's release. In 1972, Fred and Rose married. Together, they lured women into their home with promises of lodging or jobs. Some were hitchhikers, others were nannies, or even friends. Inside, the couple's depravity escalated, binding, torturing, and ultimately killing their victims before burying them in the cellar or garden. Even more horrifying was the inclusion of family in their violence. Rose's own children were beaten, sexually abused, and terrorized. When Fred's stepdaughter Heather West began speaking of leaving home, she disappeared too. The family told friends she had run off with a lover. But Heather's name would become the crack that brought everything down. In 1992, one of the younger West children told school officials that her father had sexually abused her and hinted that Heather was dead and buried under the patio. That single sentence triggered an investigation that would expose 2 decades of horror. When police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street, Fred and Rose were calm, almost welcoming. But ground-penetrating searches soon revealed what lay beneath. 9 bodies were recovered from the property, including those of Heather, Shirley Robinson, and Allison Chambers. 2 more victims were later found elsewhere, bringing the total to at least 12 confirmed murders between 1967 and 1987. The press dubbed the House of Horrors. Crowds gathered daily outside as investigators carried away evidence. Journalists described the cellar as a domestic tomb, the floor lined with lime and concrete. Fred West confessed to multiple killings, often minimizing his own role and shifting blame onto Rose. When the scale of their crimes became clear, Fred was charged with 12 counts of murder. In January 1995, before his trial began, he was found dead in his prison cell, having taken his own life. Rose West faced trial later that year. Calm and emotionless, she denied everything. The jury convicted her of 10 murders, sentencing her to life imprisonment without parole, one of the rare women in British history to receive such a sentence. In the aftermath, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. Today, the site is a small public walkway. There is no marker, no plaque, only empty space, deliberately left blank to erase what once stood there. As investigators later said, the true horror of the Wests wasn't in their cunning, but in their ordinariness. A couple who smiled at neighbors, waved from their doorstep, and buried bodies beneath their own children's feet. The arrest of Fred and Rose West in 1994 sent shockwaves through Britain. Gloucester police, who began their inquiry as a missing person search for Heather West, quickly found themselves at the center of one of the most disturbing investigations in UK history. What began with a rumor, Heather's under the patio, ended with the unearthing of multiple victims, nationwide outrage, and a trial that forced the country to confront unimaginable domestic horror. As the evidence mounted, the West's calm facade shattered. During interrogations, Fred oscillated between charm and denial. He admitted to a few accidents, then described killing Heather almost casually, as if recounting household repairs. Rose, however, remained silent, stone-faced behind her solicitor. Investigators realized she was more than a passive partner. Her fingerprints were found on restraining materials. Witnesses, including her surviving children, described how she led many of the attacks. Police built their case methodically. Forensic experts from the Home Office Forensic Science Service matched bones and dental records to missing girls, some reported decades earlier. Soil analysis confirmed multiple burial periods, showing a sustained pattern of violence stretching across 20 years. Diaries, photographs, and personal effects of the victims filled entire evidence rooms. Public interest exploded. Outside Gloucester Crown Court, news vans lined the streets. The tabloids splashed headlines like "Monsters of Cromwell Street." The BBC and The Guardian sent full-time reporters to cover every hearing. Victims' families gathered daily, searching for closure that could never truly come. In January 1995, before the full trial could begin, Fred West was found dead in his prison cell at HM Prison, Birmingham, an apparent suicide by asphyxiation. In his pockets were family photos and a final note addressed to Rose, calling her his angel. His death left unanswered questions about how many more victims might lie undiscovered. That same year, Rose West faced the court alone, charged with 10 murders. The prosecution, led by Brian Levison QC, portrayed her as the driving force, manipulative, sadistic, and every bit as violent as Fred. The defense argued she was under his control, a victim of his dominance. But witnesses, including surviving children, told another story of a mother who joined willingly, who laughed during assaults, and who beat her own children to silence them. Over 7 weeks of testimony, the courtroom alternated between horror and disbelief. Forensic pathologists described the cellar graves. Police showed photographs of the excavation. Psychologists explained the couple's pathology, a shared delusion where violence became intimacy. When the verdict came on the 22nd of November 1995, Rose West was found guilty on all 10 counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, one of the harshest sentences in British legal history. Judge Mr. Justice Mantell called her crimes depraved beyond measure and said she had shown no hint of remorse. After the trial, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished, its rubble buried under police supervision. The site remains empty, turned into a small public path, a conscious decision by Gloucester City Council to erase the physical reminder of evil, yet the legacy could not be erased. Forensic teams spent years reviewing the West's movements and possible additional victims. As late as 2023, police continued to re-examine unsolved disappearances, potentially linked to the couple. The West case also changed British policing. It inspired reforms in missing person protocols, cross-force communication, and forensic archiving. The recognition that abusers could hide behind the veneer of ordinary family life led to broader domestic violence awareness campaigns in the UK. Today, Rose West remains in custody at HMP New Hall. She has never confessed, never expressed regret, and refuses all interviews. Journalists describe her as a ghost of her former self, yet unrepentant. For the British public, the story of Fred and Rose West endures as a chilling paradox. Two people who turned the most ordinary setting, a suburban home, into a private graveyard. Their story reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are often those who smile over the garden fence, hiding their darkness behind curtains of normality. On the morning of the 14th of January 2018, a frightened teenager climbed out of a second-story window in Perris, California, clutching a broken cell phone. Her name was Jordan Turpin, 17 years old and trembling. She dialed 911 and whispered that she and her 12 brothers and sisters were being held captive by their parents, David and Louise Turpin. When sheriff's deputies arrived, nothing looked unusual from the street. A tan suburban home on Mulewoods Road, neat hedges, a parked van, but inside lay a scene investigators would later call one of the worst child abuse cases in modern U.S. history. The Turpin story began decades earlier in rural West Virginia, where David, an engineer for Lockheed Martin, met Louise, a church-going young woman from Princeton. They married in 1985, and over the years, had 13 children. To relatives, they seemed eccentric but devoted homeschooling, dressing the children alike, avoiding outsiders. When they moved to California in 2014, neighbors assumed they were a large, religious family keeping to themselves. But behind locked doors and drawn curtains, The Turpins were building what prosecutors later described as a private dungeon, disguised as a home. Inside, deputies found thin, pale children, shackled to beds with chains and padlocks. The smell of human waste was overpowering. The kitchen was stocked with food, but most of it was kept out of the children's reach. Their skin was grey from malnutrition. Their limbs were atrophied from years of confinement. Some had never seen the outside world beyond their bedroom windows. The oldest was 29, but looked no older than 15. The youngest, a toddler, was the only one not starved. According to Riverside County court filings, the Turpins enforced bizarre rituals, allowing the children to bathe only once a year, forbidding them to speak except in whispers, and punishing any defiance with beatings or strangulation. They slept by day and stayed awake at night. Louise photographed them in identical outfits, posting smiling family portraits on Facebook while, just off camera, chains dangled from bed frames. Investigators later pieced together that the abuse had continued for at least 2 decades, beginning when the family lived in Texas. There, neighbors once saw children marching in circles in the yard, but no reports were filed. In California, the Turpins registered their home as a private school, the Sandcastle Day School, with David listed as principal, shielding them from inspections. Jordan Turpin's escape changed everything. Her 911 call, recorded by dispatch, captured the trembling fear of a child who had never been allowed to speak freely. When deputies entered, she led them room to room, pointing to chained siblings. Body cam footage, later released in court, shows one deputy whispering, "I've never seen anything like this." Both parents were arrested that night and charged with 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of false imprisonment, and 7 counts of abuse of a dependent adult. During interrogation, David appeared expressionless, reciting Bible verses. Louise sobbed, insisting she was a good mother. Prosecutors described them as religious narcissists who saw their children as property. At sentencing in 2019, each parent received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Judge Bernard Schwartz told them, "You have severed the very bond that defines humanity." Several Turpin children have since spoken publicly, describing the long recovery, learning to eat solid food, to read, to trust strangers. Jordan told ABC News in 2021, "I thought we would die there. I thought we would never be free." The Turpin case exposed gaps in California's oversight of private schools and homeschooling. Riverside County officials established new welfare protocols, requiring verification of home education environments and coordination between police and child protective services. To this day, the beige house in Perris stands empty, its windows boarded and lawn unkempt, a silent monument to the horror that once hid behind its walls. Locals call it the House of Chains, and the image that endures is of a teenage girl stepping into the night, phone in hand, choosing courage over captivity, the act that freed 12 lives and exposed the evil of 2 who called themselves parents. When the Turpins were arrested in January 2018, the story stunned the world. The images of a California suburban home, its pastel walls concealing 13 abused children, became a haunting symbol of what unchecked isolation can hide. But what came after the investigation, trial, and the children's slow path to recovery revealed just how far the scars of captivity can reach. After the raid, authorities rushed the children to Riverside University Health System Medical Center. Doctors described them as severely malnourished, their growth stunted by years of starvation. The youngest were fed cautiously, in small portions, to avoid refeeding syndrome. Some children didn't recognize ordinary food. Others didn't know what medicine was. Yet, even in their fragile state, one doctor later said, "They smiled when we told them they were safe." The investigation moved swiftly. Detectives cataloged the evidence chains, padlocks, journals, and dozens of photographs documenting the family's daily life. Court filings later revealed Louise's obsession with family image, the matching outfits, the social media posts of smiling children at Disneyland. Behind those photos, however, her children were chained for weeks at a time for stealing food or disobedience. David Turpin, once a computer engineer for Lockheed Martin, maintained strict control over every aspect of their lives. He rationed food to slices of bread smeared with peanut butter and forbade bathing more than once a year. Louise Turpin enforced punishment and joined in the abuse. Investigators discovered that both parents kept diaries of discipline, chilling logs of meals withheld and chores assigned as repentance. In February 2018, both parents were charged with dozens of counts of torture, child abuse, false imprisonment, and cruelty to a dependent adult. Their court appearances were surreal. The couple arrived in matching clothes, smiling and waving to reporters. When the charges were read, Louise wept. David stood blankly, nodding. As prosecutors built their case, they emphasized intent. This wasn't mere neglect. It was methodical domination. The Riverside County District Attorney, Mike Hestrin, said in a press conference, they believed they were doing God's will. They told the children that disobedience was sin and pain was purification. To avoid a prolonged trial, the Turpins entered guilty pleas in February 2019, admitting to 14 felony counts. Each was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Judge Bernard Schwartz called their actions inhuman cruelty and told them, "You've permanently severed the bond between parent and child." But the story didn't end with their imprisonment. For the Turpin children, freedom brought new challenges. While the younger siblings were placed in foster care, the older ones began rebuilding their lives with help from social workers and trauma specialists. In 2021, an ABC News documentary, Escape from a House of Horror, revealed how some of the adult children struggled, even after rescue, lacking financial support, navigating homelessness, and grappling with trauma. Jordan Turpin, the daughter who made the 911 call, became the family's public voice. In her first interview, she said softly, "I had to do it. If I didn't, we would have died there." Her courage led to national advocacy for child welfare reform and oversight in homeschooling systems. In California, the Turpin case prompted the passage of new measures strengthening home education checks and cross-agency coordination for welfare investigations. Lawmakers cited the case as proof that isolation and secrecy could turn even the most ordinary neighborhoods into hidden prisons. As for the Perris home, it stands vacant, its windows boarded, its number still visible. 160 Muir Woods Road. Locals avoid driving by. For them, the house represents the unthinkable that two parents, respected and unseen, could hide 13 lives in plain sight. When the court clerk read the final sentence, Louise sobbed, whispering, "I'm sorry." David only stared forward, silent. But for the children who survived, their lives now stand as a testament not to horror, but to survival. A reminder that even in the darkest homes, one act of bravery can shatter decades of silence. In post-war London, the East End was a place of hard men, harder lives, and a strict moral code built on loyalty and fear. Out of its smoky pubs and boxing clubs emerged two brothers who would come to define that world, Reggie and Ronnie Kray. They were charming, stylish, and ruthless. To some, they were local heroes who protected their neighborhood from outsiders. To others, they were gangsters in tailored suits, the embodiment of organized crime in 1962 Britain. The twins were born in 1933 inches. Hoxton, the sons of a market trader. Wartime bombings forced their family into evacuation. But even as children, they were known for violence. By their teens, both were accomplished amateur boxers, winning matches across East London. Yet it wasn't the ring that made their name, it was the street. In the early 1952s, the Krays began running protection rackets, collecting fees from local businesses in exchange for safety. Their rise coincided with a Britain hungry for glamour after years of austerity. The Krays understood the new landscape perfectly. They wore sharp Italian suits, drove American cars, and opened the Double R Club, a nightclub that drew celebrities, politicians, and aristocrats. By the early 1962s, the twins were the faces of East End sophistication and menace gangster royalty who mingled with movie stars and MPs. But beneath the charm was terror. The Krays empire was built on extortion, violence, and intimidation. Rival gang members disappeared. Witnesses retracted statements. Ronnie, openly volatile and prone to psychotic outbursts, was both feared and unpredictable. Reggie, more polished, handled the business side, buying pubs, nightclubs, and betting shops. Together, they formed the Firm, a network of enforcers who controlled much of London's underworld. Their dual image fascinated the public, part gentleman, part killer. In 1965, the twins even appeared on the cover of the Sunday Mirror, smiling in Savile Row suits, a sign of how deeply they'd embedded themselves in British culture. However, cracks began to show. Ronnie's erratic behavior and obsession with power led to increasingly reckless violence. In 1966, at a nightclub called the Esmeralda's Barn, Ronnie shot and killed rival gangster George Cornell in front of witnesses after Cornell had allegedly insulted him. The act was brazen, a public execution that no one dared report. Reggie, not to be outdone, committed his own infamous killing the following year. During a party, he fatally stabbed Jack the Hat McVitie, a member of their own gang who had fallen out of favor. McVitie's body was never properly disposed of, and his disappearance became the key that would unravel the brothers' empire. By the late 1962s, Scotland Yard's Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reid had gathered enough evidence to bring the Krays down. Reid had spent years compiling witness statements and tracking associates too terrified to speak. Slowly, he built a case strong enough to pierce the twins' aura of invincibility. In May 1968, police raided the Krays' homes simultaneously. Ronnie was arrested in his dressing gown. Reggie tried to argue his way out, insisting they were victims of jealous informants. Within months, they were charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and extortion. When news of their arrest broke, the East End was divided. Some locals wept, claiming the twins had protected the poor and punished only traitors. Others quietly admitted they'd lived in fear for years. Newspapers dubbed it the end of an era, the fall of the East End Kings. At their trial in 1969, the brothers sat side by side, impeccably dressed and eerily calm. As witnesses described torture, blackmail, and murder, Reggie scribbled notes while Ronnie smiled faintly. The jury took less than a day to convict them both of murder and other serious offenses. The sentence was life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they never be released. Ronnie was later declared criminally insane and transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, while Reggie served his time at Pentonville and Parkhurst prisons. Their legend, however, never died. Books, films, and documentaries continued to glamorize the twins. Part nostalgia, part fascination. But beneath the mythology lay the truth. Two brothers who turned loyalty into tyranny and family into a brand of fear that ruled London's streets for a decade. By the end of the 1962s, the glamour surrounding the Kray twins had begun to rot. The same press that once adored their charm now splashed their violence across headlines. The British establishment, long embarrassed by its flirtation with gangster culture, decided it was time for the twins' empire to end. And when it fell hard. After years of intimidation, witnesses finally began to talk. Scotland Yard's Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reid, who had pursued the brothers for nearly a decade, quietly rebuilt his case. This time, he avoided leaks, intimidation, and bribes that had sabotaged previous investigations. Using forensic records, financial tracking, and dozens of interviews with terrified associates, he built what he later called a wall of testimony so solid, even the krays couldn't shoot through it. On the 9th of May 1968, police struck before dawn. At 6 a.m., simultaneous raids across East London brought down the firm. Ronnie Kray was found still in his pajamas, furious and uncomprehending. Reggie was arrested at his home with his wife, Frances, who looked dazed as officers led her husband away. Within hours, the legend of untouchability, the illusion that had protected the krays for so long, evaporated. The charges were massive: murder, conspiracy to murder, blackmail, and extortion. The key witnesses were men the krays had once called friends. Some testified under protection, others from prison cells. One of them, Tony Lambrianou, described how the brothers ordered the killing of Jack the Hat McVitie, a man murdered for falling out of favor. The testimony was graphic, but more devastating was the casual tone with which the firm discussed it. At trial in March 1969, the krays turned the courtroom into a stage. Both arrived in immaculate suits, adjusting their cufflinks as photographers snapped away. Ronnie smirked. Reggie kept his head high. But this time, the performance didn't work. Jurors were shielded from intimidation. Witnesses appeared one by one, recounting years of violence, beatings, kidnappings, protection rackets, and outright murder. The turning point came with forensic confirmation that George Cornell, shot by Ronnie at the Blind Beggar pub, had been killed with a revolver recovered from the twins' associate. Combined with McVitie's disappearance and testimony from within the firm, the jury had little doubt. On the 4th of March 1969, both were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve at least 30 years. Judge Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson delivered one of the most severe sentences in modern British history, declaring, "Society has a duty to be protected from men such as you men who live by terror and corruption." The fall of the krays marked the end of the East End gangster era. Their arrests crippled the firm. Their empire collapsed overnight. Many of their properties were seized. Their clubs were shuttered. Their names became shorthand for the dark side of London's post-war myth. Yet, paradoxically, the krays' fame only grew. Books, films, and television documentaries turned their story into legend. To some, they remained folk heroes, working-class boys who defied authority. To others, they were reminders that charisma can be a disguise for brutality. In later years, Ronnie Kray, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, spent his life confined to Broadmoor Hospital, where he died in 1995. Reggie Kray, ever the more composed twin, was released briefly on compassionate grounds in 2000 as he battled cancer. He died just weeks later, aged 66. Their funerals drew crowds of thousands. Former gang members, curious onlookers, and even admirers lined the streets of the East End as the hearse passed. It was a strange kind of reverence, half nostalgia, half fascination for men who once ruled by fear. Today, their names remain etched in British crime history. The Kray Twins represent both the seduction and the sickness of power, how two brothers could turn loyalty into a weapon and convince an entire city to mistake intimidation for respect. On a cold February night in 1933, a quiet street in Le Mans, France, became the setting for one of Europe's most shocking murders, a case that would blur the line between madness and rebellion, servitude and rage. The killers were not strangers, robbers, or outsiders. They were two maid sisters who had lived under the same roof as their victims for nearly 7 years. Christine and Leah Papin were inseparable. Born into poverty and abandonment, they were sent to different orphanages as children before finding work together as domestic servants. In 1926, they were hired by the Lancelin family, a respectable bourgeois household. René Lancelin, a retired lawyer, his wife, Léonie, and their adult daughter, Geneviève. At first, the arrangement seemed ideal. The sisters worked tirelessly cooking, cleaning, running errands. They rarely spoke to anyone but each other. But behind the polite exterior, tension brewed. Leonie was a strict employer, obsessive about cleanliness, and prone to criticism. Christine, the elder sister, was proud and volatile. Her protectiveness of Leah bordered on obsession. Neighbors later said they moved like shadows, always together, never apart. On the 2nd of February 1933, a storm cut power to the Lancelin home. When Madame Lancelin and Geneviève returned from shopping, they found the lights out and Christine waiting on the stairs. What happened next would become one of France's most studied crimes. In a sudden frenzy, Christine attacked Madame Lancelin, striking her with a jug. Leah joined in, and the sisters assaulted both women with a hammer and knife. When police arrived hours later, alerted by Monsieur Lancelin, and who'd grown worried when his family didn't arrive for dinner, they found the victims mutilated beyond recognition. Christine and Leah were discovered in their attic room, huddled together on the bed. The sisters immediately confessed. Christine reportedly said, "It was her or us." The brutality stunned France. Newspapers called it Le crime des sœurs Papin, the crime of the Papin sisters. Forensic examiners confirmed the killings were frenzied but methodical, lasting nearly half an hour. Both victims' eyes had been gouged out, an act psychologists later interpreted as symbolic a destruction of the gaze of authority. At their trial in September 1933, the courtroom overflowed. Intellectuals, journalists, and ordinary citizens debated whether the crime was madness, class revolt, or both. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir later cited the case as an existential metaphor, servants turning against their masters in a violent rejection of hierarchy. Jean Genet, in his play The Maids, 1947, reimagined the story as an allegory for oppression and identity. Christine, the dominant sister, took full responsibility. Her testimony alternated between lucidity and delusion. When separated from Leah, she screamed uncontrollably, begging to see her soulmate. Medical experts diagnosed shared paranoid disorder, folie à deux, where one individual's delusion is mirrored by another. The verdict was harsh. Christine was sentenced to life in prison, while Leah, considered mentally weaker and under her sister's influence, received 10 years of hard labor. Christine deteriorated rapidly in custody, refusing food and clawing at her eyes in despair. Transferred to an asylum, she died in 1937, aged just 32. Leah was released after 8 years, living out her life quietly under a false name. The Papin case became a cultural touchstone. To some, it exposed the cruelty of domestic servitude in a rigid class system. To others, it embodied the terrifying fragility of sanity itself. As one French newspaper wrote at the time, "In a house built on silence, 2 servants found their voice and spoke only in violence." The story of the Papin sisters endures as a reminder that even the meekest roles can conceal unbearable pressure, and that when love, rage, and oppression converge, the result can shake an entire society. The trial of Christine and Leah Papin began in September 1933 inches the provincial city of Le Mans. But within days, it had drawn attention from Parisian journalists, psychiatrists, and philosophers. What should have been a straightforward murder case had become something else. A mirror reflecting the anxieties of a society struggling with class divides, repression, and the nature of evil itself. The sisters arrived in court in heavy black dresses, their hands folded and eyes downcast. Christine, the elder at 28, sat expressionless, her once sharp features now gaunt from months of confinement. Leah, only 21, trembled beside her. The spectators were silent as the charges were read. Double homicide committed with extreme cruelty. The presiding judge reminded the jury that both women had confessed, yet even with that, the question of why dominated every discussion. Witnesses described a household governed by silence. The Lancelin family, respectable and strict, expected perfection from their servants. When Madame Lancelin criticized Christine, the humiliation reportedly cut deep. Psychologists later argued that years of repression, social and emotional, built a pressure that finally exploded that February night. Christine herself testified, "Something came over me. I thought she was going to hurt my sister, and I could not bear it." Medical experts proposed a diagnosis of folie à deux shared psychosis. In this rare condition, one dominant personality, Christine, transmits delusional beliefs or violent impulses to another, Leah, who mirrors them completely. It explained their eerie unity and identical testimony. Even their handwriting, analysts noted, seemed to merge. The prosecution, however, rejected insanity. They argued that the sisters' actions were the product of long festering hatred, not madness. The Lancelins were not tyrants, they said, but victims of a growing resentment among servants who forgot their place. In the politically charged atmosphere of 1930 France, where class conflict was headline news, the Papin case became a symbolic battleground. Left-wing intellectuals saw the sisters as victims of an oppressive bourgeois system. Conservatives saw them as evidence of moral decay. Forensic evidence shocked the courtroom. The coroner's report described methodical injuries, suggesting the violence lasted nearly half an hour. Both victims' eyes had been gouged out before death, a fact the prosecutor called the purest expression of hatred. Reporters fainted. One juror asked to be excused. On the 30th of September 1933, the verdict was delivered. Christine Papin was found guilty of murder with premeditation and sentenced to death by guillotine. Gasps filled the room, but public opinion quickly turned. Hundreds of petitions called for mercy, citing mental illness. 2 months later, the President of France commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. Leah, deemed to have acted under influence, received 10 years of hard labor. Their aftermath was tragic. Christine's mental state collapsed in prison. She starved herself and had violent fits. Doctors eventually transferred her to an asylum in Rennes, where she died in 1937, reportedly whispering her sister's name until the end. Leah was released in 1941 and lived quietly under an assumed identity, working as a maid until her death in the 1982. The Papin case outlived them. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described it as a revolt against dehumanization servants, reduced to instruments of cleanliness. Playwright Jean Genet transformed it into the surreal drama The Maids. 1947, where fantasy and servitude spiral into mutual destruction. Even modern criminologists still debate whether the sisters were psychotic or symbolically rebelling against a system that denied them identity. Nearly a century later, the case remains unsettling, not because of its brutality, but because of what it revealed: that violence can erupt not from strangers, but from the quiet, familiar intimacy of dependence. Before Jack the Ripper or H. Holmes, America already had a nightmare, walking its roads: 2 men, known only as the Harpe brothers. In the chaos of post-revolutionary America, Mikaja Big Harpe and Wiley Little Harpe carved their names into frontier folklore as figures so violent that even outlaws feared them. Born in the 1762 in North Carolina, the Harpes' early lives were shaped by war. They grew up during the American Revolution, serving at times as Tory raiders, stealing, looting, and killing under the pretext of loyalty to the British Crown. When the war ended, they didn't stop. They simply found a new battlefield, the untamed frontier. By the 1792, travelers in Kentucky and Tennessee spoke in hushed tones about a wagon carrying 2 men, 3 women, and a cluster of children, the supposed Harpe family. In reality, the women were captives, victims of abduction, and years of abuse. The Harpes posed as farmers or traders, using the illusion of domesticity to lure travelers into conversation. By nightfall, those travelers vanished. Bodies began appearing along the wilderness road. Throats cut, skulls smashed with tomahawks, bellies slit open and filled with stones before being dumped into rivers. The killings weren't about robbery. The harps often left valuables behind. One witness described Big Harpe as laughing like a demon as he confessed to killing a crying baby just to silence it. Historians later called them the first American serial killers. From 1797 to 1799, the Harpies moved between Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, leaving a trail of corpses. Settlers told stories of entire cabins found slaughtered families murdered in their sleep. Frontier law was primitive. There were no organized police, only militias and posses. When authorities caught up with the brothers near the Cumberland River, they escaped by murdering their own horses to block pursuit. The brutality shocked even hardened frontiersmen. Local militias formed hunting parties. Newspapers like the Kentucky Gazette began publishing warnings about the Harp Devils. In August 1799, Big Harp's rampage ended. He was cornered by a posse led by frontier vigilantes after murdering a young settler woman and her infant. When he was shot and mortally wounded, witnesses said his dying words were chillingly cold. "You're a goddamned rough set of fellows, but I don't curse you for taking my life." His severed head was placed on a stake at a crossroads between Henderson and Morganfield, Kentucky, a grim warning to travelers. The place became known for generations as Harp's Head Road. Wily Little Harpy vanished into the frontier, joining another outlaw gang led by Samuel Mason. Under the alias John Seton, he posed as a reformed man until Mason himself was killed in a dispute. When Little Harp tried to claim Mason's bounty by presenting his head to authorities, his true identity was exposed. He was arrested, tried, and hanged in Mississippi in 1804. The Harpe brothers left behind no manifestos, no motives beyond bloodlust. Historians estimate their victims numbered at least 30 to 40, possibly more, an astonishing figure for an era of sparse settlements. Their crimes were so cruel that even among outlaws, the name Harp became a curse. Modern criminologists regard them as early examples of psychopathic spree killers, motivated by domination and sadism rather than profit. Their story also marks a turning point in American justice. Their rampage helped frontier communities push for formal law enforcement, courts, and jails, the first recognition that even the wilderness needed rules. After Big Harp's execution in 1799 and Little Harp's hanging in 1804, the frontier breathed again, but not easily. Their story became more than crime, it became American folklore's first true horror. In an age before newspapers reached every cabin, their legend spread by campfire whispers and preacher warnings. For settlers, the Harpies were the embodiment of chaos before law, proof that evil could walk unpunished across miles of wilderness. The America of the 1792 had no centralized police. Frontier justice meant volunteer militias, bounty hunters, or family revenge. And the Harpes exploited that vacuum. They drifted from Kentucky to Tennessee, robbing, burning, and killing with impunity. Their victims were travelers, farmers, and even children people, whose disappearances could go unnoticed for weeks. The brothers' brutality reshaped local policy. Governors offered bounties for their capture, the first state-backed manhunts of their kind in U.S. history. Their downfall led directly to the expansion of early vigilante committees, the precursor to county sheriffs and organized law enforcement in the South and Midwest. Frontier journals from the time record that people began locking their cabins, sleeping with rifles nearby, and refusing to speak to strangers on the road. The Harpes had changed behavior across entire states. In Kentucky folklore, the Harpe story was retold with Gothic exaggeration. Big Harp became a giant-like figure who could outrun horses. Little Harp, a cunning trickster who could charm women and murder without hesitation. They were depicted as the first American monsters, not outlaws with purpose, but men driven by bloodlust. What made their legend endure was the lack of motive. Unlike highwaymen or robbers, they killed without profit or plan. Contemporary chroniclers describe their spree as murder for pleasure, an alien concept to 18th century morality. One minister wrote, "They were devils, clothed as men, sent to remind us the wilderness has its demons." Later historians, drawing on court testimonies and family accounts, linked their pathology to childhood trauma and wartime brutality. They had seen atrocities during the Revolution, and instead of being broken by violence, they learned to enjoy it. Dr. J. Winston Coleman, writing in Kentucky, the pioneer frontier, called them the first mirror to America's violent soul. By the 19th century, the harpes had become characters in dime novels and campfire tales, their story recast as both warning and entertainment. In one popular broadside from 1820, titled "The Terrible Harp Brothers and Their Road of Blood," their crimes were serialized for profit, a grim irony, turning their horror into folklore. Their name entered local geography. Harp's Hill, Harp's Head Road, and Harp's Creek remain place names in Kentucky and Tennessee, relics of fear etched into the map. Even today, historians cite their crimes as among the first documented cases of serial murder in North America, predating modern profiling by over a century. But beyond the shock, the harpe legacy had a strange civic effect. Their rampage spurred communities to create formal courts, establish county jails, and appoint riders to patrol roads, an early blueprint for public safety. In their destruction, they forced order to rise from chaos. Every retelling of the harp story ends the same way. Two brothers, bound by blood and violence, destroyed by their own brutality. Yet even their deaths didn't erase the dread they left behind. Travelers in early Kentucky swore that on foggy nights near the Red River, they could still hear hooves pounding and laughter echoing in the woods. Proof, they said, that evil doesn't die. It just changes its name. As a Tennessee preacher warned in 1805, after reading their confessions aloud to his congregation, "Beware the brotherhood of sin, for when man kills for pleasure, he becomes what no law can hang the ghost of fear itself." On the surface, the Stouter family of Springfield, Missouri, seemed ordinary middle class, church-going, quietly reserved. But behind the closed doors of their blue two-story home, a silent and methodical horror unfolded. Between 2012 and 2013, Diane Stouter and her daughter Rachel embarked on a slow, deliberate killing spree, not with guns or knives, but with something far more insidious: antifreeze. The story began on the 8th of April 2012, when Mark Stouter, Diane's husband and father of 4, suddenly died. He was 61, a local musician and youth minister, and his death appeared natural. The coroner cited organ failure, and there was no autopsy. Diane collected the insurance payout and moved on quickly. Within months, neighbors noticed her oddly upbeat demeanor. She joked that Mark's death was a relief, claiming he'd been lazy and burdened the family financially. Then, in September 2012, tragedy struck again. The Stouters' 6-year-old son, Sean, a quiet man with autism, died after a short illness. The pattern was disturbingly familiar: vomiting, confusion, collapse. Doctors again cited natural causes, and no toxicology was ordered. Diane's social media posts that week were chillingly casual. "It's been a rough few months, but life goes on." No one suspected anything until April 2013, when 4-year-old Sarah Stouter, Diane's daughter, was rushed to the hospital, barely conscious. She was suffering from organ failure. A nurse, reviewing the family's history, noticed that 2 relatives had died recently with identical symptoms. Suspicion ignited. Detectives from the Springfield Police Department obtained a search warrant for the Stouter home. Inside, they found bottles of antifreeze, ethylene glycol, stored under the sink and in the garage. What made it chilling was the pattern. Diane had mixed the toxic liquid into drinks, masking the sweet taste with soda or juice. When questioned, Rachel at first denied everything, but within hours, she broke. In a recorded confession, she described her mother's plan. She told me we'd have a better life without them, that we could be free. Investigators learned that Diane viewed her husband and son as burdens, Mark, because of his unemployment, and Sean, because of his developmental disability. Sarah, the surviving daughter, was meant to die next. Only the hospital's intervention stopped the plan. During Diane's interrogation, she showed little emotion. Detectives noted her analytical tone, as though describing a business decision. "They were costing me too much money," she reportedly said. "I guess I was just tired of them." Forensic toxicologists confirmed high levels of ethylene glycol in the victim's systems. A handwritten diary seized from Rachel's room provided even more damning evidence. One entry read, "It's almost over. I can't believe it's actually working. Mom says we'll finally have peace." The diary entries, paired with receipts for antifreeze purchases, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. In June 2013, both women were arrested. Diane was charged with first-degree murder and assault. Rachel with second-degree murder. Their trials gripped Missouri. The case's sheer coldness, a mother and daughter, methodically killing their own family, stunned even seasoned investigators. Rachel eventually struck a plea deal, testifying against her mother in exchange for a life sentence with parole eligibility. Diane received life without parole. When asked in court why she had done it, she said quietly, "I didn't want to take care of them anymore." The surviving daughter, Sarah, endured a long recovery but survived, the lone witness to her family's destruction. The Stouter case became a national headline featured on Dateline NBC, BBC News, and crime documentaries, not only for its brutality, but for its eerie banality. There were no shouting matches, no open violence, just poisoned glasses and polite smiles. In the end, the Stouter home stood empty, a symbol of suburban evil hidden behind normalcy. Prosecutor Dan Patterson summed it up best during closing arguments. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of planning, of calculation. A family dismantled, one glass at a time. When Diane and Rachel Stouter entered the Greene County Courthouse in 2015, it was as though an ordinary family drama had been rewritten into a Greek tragedy. Two women, mother and daughter, sat side by side, accused of methodically erasing their own bloodline. By then, the facts were clear. The poisoning of Mark and Sean Stouter and the near-fatal attack on Sarah had been confirmed through forensic evidence, toxicology reports, and Rachel's chilling confession. But the trial wasn't just about guilt, it was about motive, manipulation, and the strange psychology that allowed a daughter to help her mother kill. Prosecutors painted Diane as the architect, a woman whose outward religiosity and calm exterior concealed ruthless calculation. They argued that she orchestrated every step from choosing the antifreeze to timing the doses, while Rachel, eager for approval, became her accomplice. In opening statements, prosecutor Dan Patterson described Diane's control. She wasn't just the head of the house, she was the hand that poured death into a glass. Defense attorneys countered with a different narrative. They claimed Rachel had been manipulated, emotionally isolated, and psychologically dependent on her mother. To jurors, they read entries from Rachel's diary, each one a mix of guilt and obedience. "Mom says it's the right thing to do. I don't know anymore." Psychologists called by the defense testified that Rachel showed signs of dependent personality disorder, unable to resist authority figures or assert her own will. It echoed classic patterns in familicide partnerships, where one dominant personality rationalizes murder while another complies out of fear or loyalty. One of the most devastating exhibits was a receipt for a bottle of Profos antifreeze, purchased just days before Sean's death, signed by Diane herself. Another was Rachel's hand-drawn timeline, detailing when each victim would be given drinks. Detective Neil McAmis, who led the investigation, described confronting Diane with these records. "I told her we knew what she'd done. She just looked up and said, "It's all there, isn't it?" No tears, no shock. The forensic team confirmed the sequence. Mark was poisoned over several days in April 2012. Sean suffered a concentrated dose that September. Sarah's drink was prepared in March 2013, but she survived by sheer luck. In 2015, Diane Stouter pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 of assault, receiving 2 life sentences without parole. Rachel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, earning a life term with the possibility of parole after 42 years. Judge Thomas Mountjoy's words during sentencing resonated across Missouri. There is no greater betrayal than that of a parent's hand delivering death. Sarah Stouter, the surviving victim, spoke at the hearing, her voice trembling. "They took my family from me and called it mercy. I'll never understand how love can look like that." In interviews following the verdict, detectives admitted this case had shaken their faith in the idea of family. Detective McCamus later told Dateline, "We're trained to look for enemies outside the home. But evil doesn't always knock, it can live right inside your kitchen." The Stouter case joined a growing list of modern quiet homicides, where killers weaponize domestic familiarity instead of violent, slow, invisible deaths that leave little trace until patterns emerge. Documentaries from BBC News and Dateline NBC later framed the Stouts as a study in emotional detachment. Viewers were haunted not just by what they did, but by how ordinary they seemed while doing it. To this day, true crime analysts cite the Stouter murders as a rare mother-daughter killing alliance, driven by greed and convenience, rather than passion or desperation. It remains one of Missouri's most disturbing modern cases. In the final court transcript, Diane's last recorded words stand as a cold summary of the entire tragedy. "I don't hate myself for it. I just hate that I got caught." In early 1992 Canada, the nation's collective innocence shattered with one name, Bernardo. Paul Bernardo and his glamorous wife Carla Homolka looked like the perfect suburban couple, handsome, smiling, charismatic. But beneath the surface of their golden facade lay one of the most disturbing partnerships in modern crime. Born in 1964, Paul Bernardo grew up in Ontario's comfortable suburbs. Teachers called him intelligent, confident, a born salesman. Yet those close to him sensed something darker. Friends later recalled how he humiliated girlfriends, recording his control as proof of conquest. By his early 22s, he had already become the Scarborough rapist, terrorizing women near Toronto through a series of assaults between 1987 and 1990. When he met Carla Homolka, a 17-year-old pet store clerk, she was instantly drawn to his intensity. Within months, their relationship evolved into a twisted dynamic of worship and domination. Bernardo confided his violent fantasies, and shockingly, Carla encouraged them. As forensic psychologists would later testify, they formed what criminologists call a mutual psychopathy loop. One's desires validated the other's depravity. Between 1990 and 1992, the couple abducted, assaulted, and killed at least 3 young women, Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka, Carla's own younger sister. Tammy's death was officially recorded as an accident at first, the result of sedation gone wrong. But later evidence showed the couple had drugged her during a planned assault, filming the ordeal on VHS tapes later discovered by police. Leslie Mahaffey disappeared after curfew in 1991. Her remains were found encased in concrete blocks in a nearby lake. Kristen French vanished in 1992 while walking home from school. When her body was discovered, police knew a predator was at large. During the nationwide manhunt, Bernardo and Homolka maintained an air of normalcy, attending family gatherings, smiling in photographs. The duality stunned investigators later. While police canvassed their neighborhood, the killers hid videotapes documenting their crimes behind a ceiling light fixture. In early 1993, Carla fled the relationship after Bernardo became physically abusive. When police linked him to the Scarborough rapist DNA, she sought a deal. In exchange for 12 years in prison, she would testify against him and reveal the full scope of their crimes. The revelation horrified the country. Carla portrayed herself as a battered woman, claiming she acted under duress. The public dubbed the agreement the deal with the devil. During Bernardo's 1995 trial, prosecutors unveiled hours of videotapes, proving his leadership in the assaults. But they also showed Carla's active participation. She laughed, taunted victims, and followed instructions with chilling precision. Bernardo was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, receiving life imprisonment without parole. Carla, shielded by her plea bargain, served only 12 years, walking free in 2005 under heavy public outrage. The Ken and Barbie killers moniker came from the couple's appearance, perfect smiles masking psychopathy. Canadian media debated whether Carla's plea was a miscarriage of justice or a necessary bargain to secure conviction. Legal scholars still cite the case as a turning point for victim video evidence and the ethics of plea bargaining. It also changed Canadian parole transparency laws, requiring public access to victim impact statements. Today, Bernardo remains in a maximum security facility, repeatedly denied parole. Homolka, now living under a new identity in Quebec, occasionally resurfaces in news reports, sparking renewed anger each time. In August 1989, the sound of shotgun blasts shattered the stillness of Beverly Hills. When police arrived at the mansion of Jose and Kitty Menendez, they found a scene so gruesome that even seasoned detectives paused. The couple, he, a powerful Hollywood executive, she, a former beauty queen, had been executed in their den. But what made the case infamous wasn't just the crime. It was the revelation of who pulled the trigger: their own sons. Lyle, 21, and Eric Menendez, 18, told police they had returned home from a movie to find their parents slain. They sobbed on camera, clinging to each other, projecting the image of devastated sons. For 6 months, detectives treated them as victims. They inherited access to their parents' $14 million estate, buying Rolexes, Porsches, and luxury condos. But their spending drew suspicion. Investigators began retracing timelines, and whispers spread through Beverly Hills that something didn't fit. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: Dr. Jerome Oziel, a psychologist. During therapy, Eric confessed to the killings, and Oziel's mistress later leaked the taped confession to police. Prosecutors painted a picture of greed and entitlement, two pampered heirs, eliminating the only people between them and their fortune. Assistant District Attorney Pamela Bozenich told jurors, "They killed for money, plain and simple, and then they shopped." But when the trial began in 1993, the defense stunned the nation with a different narrative. Attorney Leslie Abramson revealed years of alleged sexual, physical, and emotional abuse within the Menendez household. Eric testified in tears that his father, Jose, had molested him since childhood, and that his mother ignored the abuse. Their attorneys argued the brothers acted in a state of terror, convinced their parents would kill them if they told anyone. The courtroom became a stage for America's anxieties about privilege, trauma, and truth. Cable news covered every second. Court TV turned the trial into a cultural event, the first major case to turn defendants into celebrities. Viewers argued endlessly. Were Eric and Lyle spoiled monsters or damaged survivors? The first trial ended in 1994 with 2 deadlocked juries. Public opinion was split right down the middle. Some sympathized, citing the detailed accounts of abuse corroborated by relatives. Others were enraged by the idea that wealth could excuse murder. By the second trial in 1996, public sentiment had shifted. The judge limited abuse evidence, ruling that it didn't justify premeditated killing. This time, the jury returned swift guilty verdicts for first-degree murder. Both brothers were sentenced to life in prison without parole. ensuring they would never profit from their notoriety. In prison, the Menendez brothers lived in separate facilities for over 2 decades. In 2018, they were reunited after 22 years apart, an emotional moment captured in a brief statement. "It feels like coming home." The case, once seen purely as sensational, has since undergone cultural re-evaluation. Documentaries and podcasts reframed it through the lens of abuse, psychology, and family control. New generations on social media view the brothers with sympathy, drawing parallels to cycles of trauma and silence in wealthy households. Still, the legal system never reversed its stance. Appeals were denied, and the California courts upheld that financial gain, not fear, was the primary motive. The Menendez murders changed the landscape of televised crime forever. They blurred the line between justice and spectacle, between empathy and outrage. In the mid-1990s, Belgium awoke to a nightmare that would permanently scar its institutions. The name Marc Dutroux became synonymous with betrayal of trust, corruption, and a national reckoning that reached from the smallest police station to Parliament itself. Behind the locked doors of his suburban home, Dutroux and his wife, Michelle Martin, constructed a world so depraved that it would collapse the public's faith in authority. For years, Dutroux, a former electrician with a record for kidnapping and assault, had lived in Charleroi, posing as a quiet tradesman. But beneath the house, he built hidden cells, complete with soundproofing, chains, and remote-controlled locks. Between 1995 and 1996, he abducted multiple girls, keeping some captive for months while authorities fumbled opportunities to intervene. Michelle Martin, a trained schoolteacher, was not an unwilling witness. Testimony later revealed she helped lure victims, procure supplies, and even cared for Dutroux's own children upstairs, while 2 girls, Sabine Dardenne, 12, and Letitia Delhez, 14, remained imprisoned in the cellar below. When police finally raided the home in August 1996, they found the girls alive, trembling, and emaciated, after 80 days underground. Nearby, investigators discovered the bodies of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, also children, buried in the garden. The horror deepened with every excavation. 2 more victims were found in a separate property. Dutroux had filmed parts of the abuse. Martin admitted to helping conceal evidence. What stunned the public, however, was that police had searched the house months earlier and failed to open the locked cellar door. Public outrage erupted into what Belgian media later called La Marche Blanche, the White March. Over 300,000 citizens filled the streets of Brussels in October 1996, marching in silence with white balloons to mourn the victims and denounce the justice system. The demonstrations forced ministerial resignations, the dissolution of police units, and sweeping reforms that united previously fragmented law enforcement agencies into a national structure. During Dutroux's 2004 trial, prosecutors presented a chilling mosaic of evidence: the dungeon diagrams, the videotapes, and Martin's letters pleading with him from jail. The defense claimed institutional conspiracy, hinting at pedophile networks protected by elites, a claim that, though never proven, fueled decades of distrust. Judges dismissed those theories, yet the damage to public confidence was irreversible. Dutroux was convicted on all counts: murder, kidnapping, rape, and conspiracy, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Martin, who served as accomplice and caretaker of the imprisoned girls, received 30 years. Her 2012 early release decision ignited fury. Crowds gathered outside the convent that offered her shelter, chanting, "No forgiveness without truth." Belgium responded by rewriting its parole laws and creating a federal child protection agency. Forensic teams overhauled procedures, ensuring no home could again be left unsearched due to jurisdictional confusion. To this day, victims' families mark August 15 each year as a private day of remembrance. Dutroux's crimes were not only acts of violence but symbols of institutional blindness, a nation's failure to believe its own children. One parliamentarian later said, "He didn't just bury lives. He buried our trust." Nearly 3 decades later, the phrase dutroux effect endures in Belgian politics, shorthand for public outrage so intense it can topple governments. And in classrooms where Michel Martin once taught, a single plaque now reads, "For Julie, Melissa, Sabine, and Laetitia, whose voices forced the country to listen."